Jonathan Sachs makes a point of talking about Torah and Chachma as opposed to Torah and Ma'ado, first of all. Second of all, it seems to me that, and from some practical suggestions, even if you cannot find a single person who embodies this, I'm a very big advocate about team teaching. Team teaching not necessarily for the entire year, could be for a topic, it could be for a day, it could be for a week. We did a Yom Yun once on Masa Breshit, and so therefore we linked together general and Judaic studies teachers on all sorts of things in creation. How are words created? How are poems interpreted? How are, you name it, use your imagination. But the point is to put in front of students, adults in dialogue about these kinds of issues. That in fact, it's not relegated to just a subject and therefore you do this. Disciplines are artificial anyway. There's a great statement by Alfred North Whitehead who talks about how, the real subject matter that we should be studying is life, not math and English and history. All of that sort of somehow combines, and you have to make this live. So in that sense, you can get very misled by being committed to a particular discipline and thinking that it is inviolate and therefore it has to stand on its own. How can you sort of soften the edges of the disciplines so that they will merge together, interdisciplinarity, not simply within general studies and within Judaic studies, but between Judaic studies and general studies, I think is an important project for a school to, again, show students that, these things are meant to be thought of in tandem. I remember when I was first starting to teach, I was assigned to a room that a certain math teacher spent most of his time. He would come early and stand in the doorway and come, about 10 minutes early. He had the next class there, and he would conduct, I consider it heckling, but it was a discussion. And I thought it was very valuable for the students to listen in on our discussions. In other words, and he challenged me on various things, and I would respond. And in that sense, again, there was evidence of the fact that things are not in this kind of, pristine separation and isolation, but in fact, there is some sort of gestalt that can be created. To look at it even from an educational point of view, the whole child philosophy is saying that a child's education is everything that he learns, and therefore to think that what a child learns is just separate subjects for which you get grades, but that never have to be in interaction or dialogue with one another is really not the way people think and not the way people function.
I think two comments I would make. One is that regardless of how you frame the technical question of whether you're defining something in addition to Torah or a more expansive notion of Torah, it has to be clear that the acquisition of all knowledge is a religious act. I think that's just that cannot be. It cannot be that any aspect of learning is seen as separate from one's religious being. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that even if one has a separate notion, the notion that you can study Torah without being in constant dialogue with all other forms of knowledge is almost incomprehensible to me. Like the notion that you would learn Bereshit and then afterwards discuss cosmology, as if Bereshit is not about cosmology, and you never discuss the question of whether Bereshit is about cosmology, is just about incomprehensible to me. You have to make decisions about what Bereshit is about. Bereshit could be about cosmology, Bereshit could be about the origin of humanity, Bereshit could be metaphors about the nature of humanity. All those are choices. And those choices all take place in the context of a serious intellectual engagement with the world. The notion that you can learn, let's say, the fourth chapter of Bava Metzia, which is about how we define value economically in a society without knowing economics, that what you're just doing is doing bad Torah. Right? We should not. Right? The notion that you can do Sanhedrin without relating to political theory is just saying that we should learn Torah on an elementary school level and then send them off to college to do it for real. So I just find it the whole notion that Torah could be studied in isolation, doing anything other than ancient Near Eastern linguistics, at which point, of course, you should study linguistics, is just it's utterly the question shouldn't start. That's my take. The question shouldn't start. It's obvious that when you learn Torah, Torah has to relate to the real world. Torah has to relate to all the knowledge you have. And then the question of how you implement that curricularly, since as in any other field, right? So this is also true of political science and economics, and economics has to relate to politics, and politics has to relate to philosophy and things like that. But the premise has to be that Torah is serious, and if Torah is serious, then it relates to all knowledge.
What we'd like to do now is open this up. We've kind of covered a range here of issues, but I know there's just so much more we could discuss. So the floor is open. We've got a sound problem here, so just please sort of shout out your question. We'll get it, and then we'll try to deal with it.
One of the most interesting things for me were, Rabbi Kaplan, what you just said, and I think as you describe it, it makes sense to me that that's your perspective, because you described your learning as being both a yeshivish and with your mother's library, and so it makes sense that that's how you think about Torah. But as most teachers in Orthodox schools didn't study the way you studied, which was obvious from the whole conversation, it's not clear that for other people that's how they actually study Torah. So how do we get to the place where people can be in the conversation? So teaching is an idea, but it's interesting for me to hear shining examples of Orthodox learning that really reflect that, aside from in your personal classroom.
And when I was at Maimonides, we ran something called Electricity Week, which was where the goal was to have the physics and math teachers taught the equations of the nature of electromagnetism, and the Tanakh teachers taught the Mareh Chashmal, and the Talmud teachers taught how in terms of Hilchot Shabbat we addressed it, and the English teachers taught science fiction stories about the role of nature of technology in society, and the history teachers taught the Industrial Revolution. Right, and that was one really wild model, which didn't really hold together. We didn't have the kind of administrative support for it that was really necessary, but it was an interesting model. Again, I have a lot more freedom in a sense, so I teach a class on medical ethics, and I teach a class on science and Judaism, but I guess for me, I think that in the same, to me, a critical element of the faculty is faculty members who see part of not their job as teachers, but their job as Jews, right? To see Torah as a serious treatment of the world. So they have to, at the very least, be open to recognizing that since Torah addresses the world and there is knowledge about the world elsewhere, that's part of what they do. Now, you have to be honest with students about it. I'll give you one. Everyone has that one story. So here's one story for me about just how you can set students up falsely for this. In the Haredi summer camp where I was a counselor once, we were doing a Gemara which talks about how much grape leaves and detritus a Nazir can eat before he violates his Nazirut, right? Because Nazirim are not allowed to eat grapes. And it turns out that the amount you can eat is the amount that would displace a certain measurement of wine. So the kids asked, how much is that? And it turns out I didn't remember. So I said, oh, good, I remember our committees had an experiment about this, so let's get a male scale and a rubber ball, right? And let's find out how much water is displaced by floating objects. And so we ran the experiment. We discovered that floating objects displace their weight, and then we discovered that a Nazir can eat the amount of grape solids that displace